welcome to a new episode of Policy Implications podcast, where policy meets research. I'm your host, Olga Zadorozhna from Kozminski University, where I teach and do research in empirical economics. My guest today is Carlo Schwarz, who is an assistant professor at Akademia University and an expert on the impact of social media on political outcomes. Today, we will be discussing his recent paper on the impact of social media on the US elections that he co-authored with Thomas Fujiwara and Karsten Mueller. So welcome, Carlo, and let's get started. First, please tell us about your research expertise and how did you become interested in the topic of social media impact on political outcomes?
Yeah, it's great to be here. My research usually would be described, I think, as political economy. So it lies somewhere at the intersection of traditional economics and political science. And as you've already stated or pointed out, is my research in recent years increasingly focused of all the real world impact social media have. And probably my initial interest in this question of social media research were really kindled with the increasing prevalence of inflammatory and hateful content we saw online, particularly in my own home country, Germany, during the height of the refugee crisis. And this basically motivated my co-author, Karsten Mueller, and me basically to start really investigating whether these hateful posts can have an impact on anti-refugee incidents. And basically we were able to document that there indeed seems to be a link between social media content and real world violence. Then, of course, basically Donald Trump soon after was elected president of the United States. And also basically, unsurprisingly, his Twitter content can be characterized as pretty inflammatory. So we then shifted our interest more to the United States and tried to investigate whether his rhetoric on Twitter has an impact on anti-Muslim hate crimes in the US. And then now in the most recent project, we, of course, were interested then in the impact of social media and elections. And basically, it's like often in research, one research question leads to the next. And with regards to this topic, it of course was like this large amount of media coverage after the 2016 presidential election, which claimed that either Trump's tweets were so successful in convincing people to vote for him or not to vote for Hillary Clinton, and also these concerns about interference of like foreign agencies like the Internet Research Agency in Russia and the Iranians through social media in the election. And given, despite like these wide-reaching debates, so far there was like very little evidence that social media can have a tangible impact on election outcomes. So then we started basically to really look into like the connection between like Twitter in particular and US voting outcomes in 2016.
So yes, in your paper, you analyze the Twitter and the tweets in the US. So what kind of candidates, political candidates, do Twitter users tend to prefer? Do they vote more for Republicans, the Democrats in the US? So what is their preference, political preference, and what is the reason behind that?
Overall, I think not only in our own research, also like based on surveys we know about, basically from Pew Research, for example, we have information that Twitter users are predominantly leaning towards the left of the political spectrum. So in the US, towards the Democratic Party. This is also partially due to the fact that Twitter users are far more highly selected than the average social media user, for example, users of the YouTube or Facebook, where like Twitter, for example, only has 68 million users, so a bit more than 20% of the US population are on Twitter. The Facebook usership in the US is 4 times higher, so they're far more representative of the overall population. But the people that appear to use Twitter are really selective. Like on average, they are wealthier and higher educated and also selected from specific professions. Like, for example, a lot of journalists are on Twitter. And we know that most Twitter users, at least according to the surveys we have, seem to basically disagree basically with Donald Trump's content on Twitter. And also most of the tweets about politics in the US are produced by people from the left side of the spectrum. In our own research, we then looked for example, at a Twitter following of the members of Congress in the US. And there we can document that based on any meaningful metric you might be interested in, like the number of tweets, the number of followers, the number of likes, the number of retweets these like politicians receive, the Democrats are always ahead. So they have like a larger Twitter following and a larger Twitter reach. And this is not only because they are somehow more effective in using Twitter, it is also basically like driven by the fact that the population of Twitter users is just more left-leaning in general.
And do you think this effect is the same for other countries? So, for example, European Twitter users, are they similar in their political views to the US Twitter users?
It depends a bit. Of course, I don't have statistics on all European countries. What I know so far, at least basically for the countries I looked at, is that, for example, in Britain, also there we see similar patterns compared to the US. So while Facebook users are more or less representative, and this is also one of the reasons why in our study in Germany, we focused on Facebook users. Twitter users, for example, in the UK are also far more supportive of the Labour Party and against like topics like Brexit. And this is also why maybe a lot of people then got basically surprised by the overall sentiment in like in the UK. If your main source of information or like the main medium of exchange is Twitter, you will see a lot more people being against Brexit than for it. So also there we seem to see the selection effects. Of course, one major difference is that Twitter use, at least in the US, even though it's only around 20%, it's still higher than in many other European countries. So, for example, in Germany, Twitter only recently basically increased in popularity, but it's also used by a far smaller fraction of the population.
And what about your paper? So what exactly did you do there? What data did you use? And what was the main identification strategy?
Yeah, so as stated previously, we were interested in whether social media and Twitter will have an impact on election results. So we need two main measures for that. We need basically US election outcomes, and in particular, we use data at the county level in the US. So there are a bit more than 3,000 counties. And the canonical source for this are basically always produced by David Light, which is a political scientist who's producing this data. So we have data for all elections in the US, so House elections, Senate elections, as well as the presidential elections since the early 2000s. We could go back further in the past, but Twitter was only founded in 2006, so there's not much point to look earlier. We just use it as a placebo check to avoid that already before the appearance of Twitter, there's any meaningful difference between counties. And then we have a measure of Twitter usage at the county level. So the number or an approximation of the number of Twitter users in a county based on a 7% sample of the Twitter users in the US from at the time like 2015. So we wanted to measure that, of course, before the election and before Donald Trump's presidential run, because he might have shifted the geography of Twitter, even though the data don't suggest this has happened. It's just like for the credibility of our assumptions, it's better if you use the measure in the pre-period. And of course, the most simple thing we could do would just be to look at the amount of Twitter usage in a county and the number of votes the Republicans receive, and then say, okay, whether these basically are correlated. But given, as previously stated, that Twitter users are predominantly liberal, we would likely see a correlation even in the absence of any meaningful effect of these two variables, of the effect of social media on elections. And it could be purely driven by the fact that more liberal counties have more Twitter users. So to get around these, we are exploiting basically an early stage shock to the adoption of Twitter. So basically this is what economists call an identification strategy. So I think it's probably easiest to understand that if we think about what would be the ideal experiment we would like to have in reality to basically identify the effect of Twitter. What we would need to do is basically we would need some counties would randomly need to get more Twitter users, or we would give them basically better access to Twitter, while other counties have less access. And if you could randomly assign that to counties in the US, like in a medical experiment, then we basically could identify the effect of Twitter usage. Of course, we can't do that, but the second best, or we argue, is that we can make use of the fact that in 2007, Twitter had a very important launch event. It's a South by Southwest festival, which is a music festival and conference that takes place every year in Austin, Texas. And what we can show in our data, based on like a lot of micro data we have collected on these or followers of this festival, is that the home counties of the likely attendees of this festival really were set on a differential growth path. So after the festival, these basically users who went to this festival, and a lot of them joined Twitter, went back to their home counties and spurred the growth of Twitter in their home counties. And we can show really how Twitter usage then picks up in these counties and stays at an elevated level until today. And so we argue that this shock basically does exactly that. It basically puts more Twitter users into areas at like pretty much at random. What we now, of course, have to rule out is that that basically we have selection based on the attendance of this festival, so that people who are interested in this festival come from counties that are more left-leaning. And to do so, what we are doing is we look at counties where people already basically also are interested in the festival, but already joined before the festival. So that means these counties didn't receive any additional people, so we don't see any impact on the amount of Twitter usage in these counties. But they should be selected, and we can indeed show that based on all the observed characteristics we have, these counties are very similar to the counties we see people basically going back to during the time of the festival. But interestingly and importantly for our strategy is that for the home counties which received additional Twitter users as a result of this festival, we identify this effect on Twitter usage and on election results later on, while for these earlier counties, we never see any effect. And we argue that it's basically most plausibly explained by an impact of Twitter usage on election outcomes.
And so what are the main results of your study?
So to briefly summarize, probably we have of course a lot of different results, but the main result is probably that in the 2016 presidential election, we find a negative effect of Twitter on the Republican vote share. So this seems to suggest that if anything, Donald Trump appears to have won despite of Twitter and not because of it. So that goes in the opposite direction of a lot of these popular narratives. Then, of course, given that we have the data, we also looked at earlier presidential elections, so 2012 and 2008. As at these points in time, of course, also a lot of people argue that Obama was successful in mobilizing followers through Twitter. But interestingly, we don't find any effect in these elections, whether in one direction or the other. And of course, this can partially be explained by the fact that Twitter usage had to increase over time. In 2008, there were just less than like a few 100,000 people on Twitter. In 2012, there were clearly more users, but still a lot lower than there are today. But even more interestingly, we don't find any effect on Senate and House elections that took place in 2016 on the same day. So that means that usually people go to the election and you get 3 ballots, one for the presidential, one for the House, and one for the Senate election. People decided to vote against Donald Trump, but not against the Republican Party on the same day, just on a different ballot. And this really suggests that this Twitter effect we are measuring seems to be very specific to Donald Trump. And it's really, we then look at individual level data, and we can really show that the independents and moderate Republicans that are on Twitter are the ones that seem to get turned away from Donald Trump as political candidate. And we can show that even in comparison to other Republican presidential candidates. So we have approval ratings for these candidates over time. And we can show that while, for example, more moderate candidates like Marco Rubio and John Kasich, their approval ratings are not negatively affected. We mainly find this negative effect for like the candidates furthest to the right. So Donald Trump, and also slightly less negative, but also statistically significant for Ted Cruz. So our current interpretation of these findings is really that Donald Trump's inflammatory rhetoric and the backlash against that on Twitter turned moderates against him, and then basically make them less likely to vote for him. And we have basically also have collected hundreds of millions of tweets from these elections to really show that the political slant of the tweets that mention Donald Trump is predominantly, again, from the Democratic side. So in our data, 75% of the bit over 80 million tweets sent about or mentioning Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election appear to be sent by people from the Democratic side of the spectrum, while only the remaining 25% come from the Republican side. And this, of course, again, speaks to basically the slantedness of this Twitter network.
That's very interesting. So in terms of the policy implications, basically, if certain people that use certain social media, such as Twitter, they are more prone to vote for a particular candidate, well, in this case, maybe against a particular candidate, then probably political campaigns can use this information in their agenda to maximize the probability of winning, right?
To some extent, potentially, yes. I think it's clearly a very important question, but to some extent, it's like based on our evidence alone. In the moment, it is slightly hard to answer, as basically our paper shows that social media seem to have like these effect on elections, but in our specific case, it seems to be driven by the backlash against a specific candidate, and so what basically our other results suggest that so far, at least, the Democrats have been not able basically to mobilize or like be able to convince these independent and moderate Republicans through their usual campaigns. It was rather just basically that these people decided to vote against Trump. So it was rather an act of self-harm and not an basically ingenious act of political campaigning. And I think that's also really, I think when it comes to social media, always the interesting thing that basically what people always think about as these echo chambers, where people of similar opinion are funneled into their own echo chambers and then talk to people of similar opinions, which of course makes them more difficult to reach for political campaigns, particularly because Twitter now also has banned political advertisement, and basically the politicians now would need to reach out to these basically people on the other side or slightly other side of the political aisle, which might be quite challenging. So it's not obvious that the Democrats basically can immediately make use of this liberal slant of Twitter. Also, it's of course important that given that the predominant part of this population is already liberal, there are no votes for them to be gained there, as these people already vote for them. So it really it always basically in the end in elections hinge on how many of the independents and moderate you can pull on your side and in which direction this will swing, especially in the US, where due to the electoral college, elections are usually decided just in a few swing states. But in our paper, at least, we have some basically, we cannot create a measure for swing states, but we can at least show that the effects of Twitter on election are larger for counties with many moderate voters, or also counties which, when we look at their electoral history, have swung for Democrats as well as Republicans over time. So at least basically, it really seems to be the people that are undecided that are probably the ones who should be targeted by these political campaigns, while it's probably a lost cause to try to convince basically very strong Republicans that are on Twitter of basically the Democratic creed.
And also, due to recent events, it seems like we have another player on the political arena, which is, well, the owner or the owners of social media platforms that have power to censor political content by, for example, banning some people from Twitter or Facebook, like they did recently with Donald Trump. So what do you think about them? What power do they have, or the political agenda and political chatter going on Twitter or Facebook? So are they becoming the new players in the political arena?
I think these social media companies, at least based on the research I'm aware of, clearly yield a lot of political power. But at least so far, we also have to say that the way they relatively they used a lot of restraint in yielding this power. Basically, I think Donald Trump was now the first time they ever removed a Twitter account of a major politician. Before, they always had the policy, given that they are just a platform, they're not a media outlet, they're not doing didn't want to make this kind of decisions. And so far, at least, basically what we know, who knows what's going to happen in the next months and years and how these platforms might change. But so far, these platforms, despite that, I think one can clearly argue that the owners of these platforms are clearly left-leaning and might have political biases. Their policies with this regard have been relatively neutral. I think what is more interesting, is the power they yield indirectly. Through because what is really at the core of Facebook is this Facebook algorithm that's basically making predictions of what people would like and what they should see in their feed, what types of groups that should be suggested to them. And these algorithms, they don't have any political preference. The optimization target of this algorithm is simply the revenue of the company and to keep people engaged on the network. But based on what we know so far is that these algorithms are a reason for a lot of the problems, as they basically really seem to siphon people into these echo chambers and suggest them more and more like-minded content, which then leads to polarization and conflict and I think it's rather this political power of these companies and the way they curate also their Twitter feed or their social media feed is what we really should be worried about in the moment, and what these companies maybe also should consider if there's a way to basically improve on the current metrics in some shape or form.
And do you think the government should step in to regulate those mechanisms and those, the artificial creation of those echo chambers?
I think this is a really difficult question, and despite the years of research I've been doing now, and also the negative effects I see in my own data, I'm still torn on that, because to some extent I also don't trust the government with basically coming up with reasonable regulation rules for these algorithms. As the government probably and at the moment from the outside, nobody really knows what goes into these algorithms in the end. So I think it's a very difficult question. I think it would really need some cooperation with these social media companies to understand basically whether we can improve this algorithm without making the entire business model void, which is just based on advertisement. But in principle, basically the problem is not a new one. We always had slanted content on news, and we also know that basically radio and other traditional media platforms have been linked to violence. It's now just basically that we have an additional one that might be more potent given its nature. But I think that's something the future will tell, basically whether government regulation will in the end become necessary, or whether we basically find a better equilibrium ourselves in the future, given that these media platforms are relatively young. I think it seems like Twitter, launched in 2006, that's 15 years now, that might seem like a lot of time. But if we, for example, look back at the introduction of the seatbelt when it comes to cars, cars were invented at the end of the 19th century. Seatbelts in most European countries were introduced in the second half of the 20s, meaning that and that was far more obvious intervention, that basically where cause and effect were clearly more connected than in these indirect effects we are basically looking at in the moment in the case of social media. So while it always might seem like a good idea that the government swoops in and solves it, I think history is ripe with examples basically where there's a government failure and government overreach as well. So I wouldn't want the government to run these social media companies. So I also would be a bit slightly wary of them regulating these companies as well.
So basically the responsibility now is on us, the users of social media, so that we stay conscious of what potentially goes on into those algorithms, I guess, and we just need to be aware of the fact that, you know, the news, the feed that we see, it's artificially created for us, for our preferences, right?
Certainly, and that's always the easiest one, but we also know that human beings are fallible and we are prone to our own biases, but it can only help if people are aware that these algorithms are curated in a way that basically might have point them in specific directions, and that they actively also seek out opposing information. So in my personal media diet, I basically actively try to basically watch YouTube channels from like completely opposing sides of the political aisle, just to get both views on a topic, which often can be enlightening. But I doubt that this in itself basically also will provide a solution. I think it's, in the moment, basically, we are at a difficult point in time, but I hope that if we look back in 10 to 20 years, I think a lot of things might look a lot better. And so I'm to some extent, I'm also still optimistic, because also social media clearly also have positive effects on people's lives, and also has the potential to connect people, so if we use them correctly, I think it could be an amazing technology. So we will just have to see how it evolves in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlo. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
It was great to talk to you.